Shaitan Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Dear students, Assalamu alaikum. I am Ab Rahim from Boys Higher Secondary School, Tarathpora. Dear students, as our topic today is government budget and the economy, and subtopic is budget expenditure. Dear students, first of all, we must know what is meant by this budget expenditure. Budget expenditure refers to the estimated expenditure of the government. Estimated expenditure of the government. These are the important words. Estimated expenditure of the government on its development and non-development during the fiscal year. As you know, what is meaning the fiscal year? Fiscal year starts from is between this April, May, March to April. This is called as the budgetary fiscal year. Now, dear students, this budget it has this budget expenditure has two branches, that is revenue expenditure and capital expenditure. Revenue expenditure and capital expenditure. What is a revenue expenditure? Revenue expenditure of the government are those expenditures which have the following two characteristics. Revenue expenditure having the two characteristics. Number one, the expenditure do not create assets for the government. Important sentence, important word. These expenditure do not create assets for the government. Even though the government makes a huge expenditure on this revenue expenditure, but still then asset there do not create asset for the government. For example, expenditure by the government on old age pensions, salaries, and scholarship are to be treated as a revenue expenditure because these are just routine expenditures, not creating assets of any sort. Okay, dear students. Number two, these expenditures do not cause any reduction. These expenditures do not cause any reduction in liability of the government. Expenditure on the payment of loans, for example, causes reduction in the government liability. Accordingly, this is not to be treated as revenue expenditure. In short, revenue expenditure refers to the estimated expenditure of the government in a fiscal year which does not either create assets or cause a reduction in the liabilities. And number two part of this is capital expenditure. Capital this was revenue expenditure and this is capital expenditure. There are two main things which we must know about this. What are those? Number one, create assets for the government. Create assets for the government. Development. Capital expenditure, number one, causes reduction in the liability of the government. Causes reduction in the liability of the government. That number two is non-development expenditure. This creates assets for the government. This is with this revenue expenditure, and now I will repeat it. Capital expenditure, two things, create assets for the government. Number one, equity or shares of the domestic or multinational corporations purchased by the government may be cited as an example. Number two is causes reduction in liabilities of the government. Causes reduction in the liabilities of the government. The repayment of loans certainly reduce liability of the government. Accordingly, this is to be treated as capital expenditure. In short, capital expenditure refers to the estimated expenditure of the government in fiscal year which either creates assets, or causes reduction in the liabilities. Now, development, this development and non-development expenditure. This was number one, and number two is development expenditure. What is meant by development and non-development expenditure? Development expenditure. This relates to the government and development activities of the government. Simply, development expenditure means this relates to the growth and development activities of the government. This includes expenditure on education, health, industry, agriculture, transport, roads, canals, rural development, water works, and generation of power. This also includes loan given by the government to enterprises like Air India or Indian Airlines, non-departmental enterprises for purpose of the development. And this is non-development expenditure. Non-development expenditure of the government relates to the non-development activities of the government. This includes expenditure on administration, defense, collection of taxes, interest on loans, payment of old age pensions. That is non-development. And number second of this is plan and non-plan expenditure. Plan expenditure, plan and non-plan expenditure. Now, what is meant by plan expenditure? Plan expenditure refers to that expenditure which is incurred by the government to fulfill its planned development programs. This includes both consumption as well as investment expenditure by the government or planning commission of the country. Expenditure on agriculture, power, communication, industry, transport, public utilities, health and education are some of the noble examples of plan expenditure. And number two is non-plan expenditure. Non-plan expenditure, this refers to all such government expenditures which are beyond the scope of the planned development programs. This includes both consumption as well as investment expenditure by the government. Example, what is the example? Relief to earthquake victims for food or for construction of house. That includes a non-plan expenditure. Broadly, any expenditure other than plan expenditure is treated as non-plan expenditure. Thus, government expenditure is equal to government expenditure is equal to revenue expenditure plus capital expenditure. This plan is expenditure other than this is government expenditure is called revenue expenditure plus capital expenditure, or we can say total government expenditure is equal to plan expenditure plus non-plan expenditure, or total government expenditure is equal to development expenditure plus non-development expenditure. Now, my dear students, I hope that today's topic, budget expenditure, is now clear to you, and tomorrow I will come with new topic, that is budget deficit before you. Assalamu alaikum.